Greetings. Hope you're all doing well. Anything important happened since the last time we met? Okay. Let's see. Oh, Mirza, please. Oh, your thumb is, I got it. It means that everything's good. Got it. All
I was
right.
trying to wave, but I couldn't find the React to do that.
Okay. Mirza, what's on your mind?
No, I was just trying to say hello, like the wave emoji.
Yes. Okay.
Sorry.
Yes. Well, got it. Got it. Hello, by the way. All right. Anybody have anything to report or whatever? Um, let's see. Well, we got a couple of minutes while people come in. Don't go anywhere, Martino. Okay. So you and Catcher are the guys who seem to know some thermodynamics more than the rest of us. So just for a few minutes, and we'll probably get back to this later. I was left with this idea that um, that life, or at least the evolutionary structure struggle that we perceive as now containing living things, and in particular us, goes back very, very, very far, right? It pretty much happens as soon as what happens that I don't know, but probably soon after Earth formed or cooled or something like that. And but we were looking a little bit at the details of how that happened, and we had the idea that there are in the world batteries. That is to say, things that have stored, I don't know whether it's free energy or what we should call it, uh, in a small package, and that this free energy or this energy can be exploited to reverse the entropy that a system, which we might think of as alive if its copy numbers are going up, uh, uh, may acquire just naturally through time. Okay, so the batteries themselves, which in some cases we were talking about molecules that held little amount of energy in bonds. And this might happen in the the deep sea vents and things like that. There, I think it was hydrogen sulfide that was what the animals were eating ultimately. Is that right? It was some sulfur compound. Well, it doesn't matter very much, but there was something there. Let's call it compound A or molecule A that stored this energy. But just having batteries around doesn't make them alive. But the formation of batteries themselves is just part of what happens in physics because of physical laws. But the batteries themselves are not alive. They have to be put into something where they power the reverse of entropy, it seems, if they're going to be alive. So, and I gave the example, which I thought was a good one, that most of the, for example, electromagnetic radiation received by a cell, which is receiving then energy, it's mostly destructive. It increases the entropy of the cell. But electromagnetic radiation of a certain frequency in plant cells decreases the entropy of the cell by effectively storing some of that energy in little batteries and then expending it to organize the cell. Okay, so here's the homework assignment. Since we got to get to the regular lecture, can you tell me, I made up this polymer kind of RNA world thing, but maybe you could make up a more believable sort of early life thing where catalytic properties lead to higher than normal or expected or equilibrium uh, copy numbers of certain molecules over others. So I know it's very vague, and this is in general, but I think, Martino and Katcher, have an inside track of being able to explain what would really go on. So if any of you get the time to contemplate that, this earliest form of life might have been, please let me know. And one of the things that Dr. Biebel brought up is that the question was, is a growing crystal of salt, say, is it alive? In whatever sense. Oh, are you prepared to answer that right now? Yes.
Yeah, well, this is crystals are a very interesting phenomenon because they're one of the few examples of spontaneous processes in nature in which entropy decreases.
Yes, that's what made it
But
interesting.
but in order for that to happen, any spontaneous reaction has a negative free energy change. So it
Yeah.
means it's exergonic, it releases energy. And in order for
Yes.
crystals to spontaneously form, even though the energy associated with entropy is increasing, the overall energy is decreasing because the crystal is actually giving off heat. So the reason why
Okay.
ice freezes is because it's losing heat energy at the same time that it's decreasing its entropy. So it's kind of the decrease in entropy is thermodynamically unfavorable for a
Yes.
spontaneous process to happen, but it's counterbalanced by the fact that at the same time, whatever material is freezing into a crystal is also losing heat.
Right. So, oh, please go on.
So, and the reason that that's not alive is because living organisms are have to regulate their temperature, and so their internal heat energy is not changing to compensate the decreases in entropy that are associated with anabolic processes or biogenic reactions. Yeah.
Okay. I liked what you said so far. I didn't really, you know, I'm not sure this living things have to regulate their temperature. Now, maybe they do, but I'm not sure of that. Okay, but rather than have this discussion now, you've taken us further down the road, and we'll return to this if we get the time because it's interesting. All right, thank you, Martina. Let's see. Okay, well then let's turn to the book. All right, get ready, William. All right. Okay. You remember that I expressed my skepticism about the grandmother hypothesis. And so I've now written a new chapter as a result of our discussion. Okay. And I call the chapter Cui Bono. You guys know what that means, or have we discussed that? Did Cui Bono come up earlier? No? Yes? No? Okay. Well, Cui Bono means who benefits. And it's commonly the case. It's most commonly used in police work. or on television shows about police work. And it means you come to a crime. Let's make it dramatic, a murder. And so the detective is supposed to have learned cui bono. He's supposed to have learned to ask the question, who benefits? Who benefits financially from this murder? Who may benefit emotionally from this murder? Who may benefit in any number of ways, okay? And it's, you look for who benefits. All right. And so I think here's the chapter I wrote and called, for now, Cui Bono.
In the previous chapter, I expressed my skepticism regarding the grandmother hypothesis. My skepticism stemmed from its failure to pass the pre-theoretic cui bono test. It did not explain why the gene's prospects of survival would benefit from foregoing more years of reproduction in return for a grandmother's contributions to grandchildren's success.
Okay, so let me tell you a little story about my mother when she became a little old lady. She used to go on day trips on buses with a bunch of other little old ladies to Reno, Nevada. We lived in San Francisco. And they would gamble, mostly slot machines. And when my mother got back, if I saw her, I would say, "Mom, how much money did you win?" And she'd say, "I won $111, Leonard." Okay. And then I knew to ask the following question. "How much money did you lose, Mom?" I lost $189. Okay. So, of course, what really mattered was the net. Yeah. And she had lost. Okay. So that's what the cui bono test is partially about. Genes and preens, it's not enough to show, for example, in the grandmother hypothesis, that grandmothers, once they have menopause, may spend more resources on grandchildren. That's like the win for the genes, potentially. But you can't ignore the loss and think you're done, because you've foregone a huge number of reproductive years. And so to make an argument that I don't find adequate, you must look at the net. It's not enough to say there's some advantage. You have to look at the net and decide, is the advantage sufficient, as best we can understand it, to make it worthwhile for the genes to go down this path? Okay. So that's the cui bono test.
There are numerous other widely held scientific hypotheses that seem to fail the cui bono test. Below, I list a few.
All right, and the few are, so far, the four that we brought up in the class discussion. Okay. And then here's a caveat.
As with the grandmother hypothesis, I am not asserting that the phenomena these hypotheses claim to explain are or are not real, nor am I asserting that the hypotheses themselves are correct or incorrect. Rather, I am asserting that the evidence in support of these hypotheses is inadequate.
Okay. So I've written a brief comment on these four that we talked about, and I'm interested if you guys have come up with some more.
Inadequate. The baby walking hypothesis. Why don't human babies walk until they are about 11 months old? The standard hypothesis is that when women began to walk upright, their pelvises became smaller, and as a result babies were born with smaller brains that needed to grow and mature after birth to get the necessities for walking. But a human baby is incubated for about 9 months and has a brain of about 350 grams months, while
typo, I'll fix it here.
as best I could discern from the data available, a newborn gazelle is incubated for about 6 months and has a brain of about 25 grams, and a new hatched duck has been incubated for about 1 month, and has a brain of less than 1 gram. Yet the latter two animals both walk and even follow appropriate adults, typically their mothers, immediately after birth.
Right? So this argument that, oh, the brain was too small and, it hadn't developed large enough or it didn't have enough time to develop well enough to allow for walking earlier than, okay. That is, I think, doesn't hold water. Yes? No? Objections? Okay. I was going to call this chapter, Don't Believe Everything a Scientist Says. In fact, maintain a high degree of skepticism. Okay. Except, of course, for me. Yes. All
The
right.
gay uncle hypothesis. Why are some human males born gay? A gay uncle hypothesis is that because gay men are less likely to expend resources on raising offspring, they can contribute more resources on their nieces and nephews. This is much like the grandmother hypothesis and fails to explain the benefits to the genes of lowering the probability of reproductive success in return for aiding nieces and nephews.
Okay. Is that adequate for an explanation? My explanation of at least for skepticism here. Okay. Then I went to the circumcision hypothesis.
The circumcision hypothesis. Why is circumcision medically valuable? One form of the standard hypothesis is that circumcision lowers the risk of UTIs, transmission of STIs, and phimosis.
Phimosis is a failure of the foreskin to retract. Okay.
Phimosis. However, as best I could discern, horses suffer from UTIs, STDs, and phimosis, and they have prepuces.
Okay. A prepuce is the sort of generic term of covering. In humans, it's called a foreskin.
Prepuces. Further, it appears that all male mammals have prepuces, called foreskins in humans. So, for roughly 200 million years, all mammals have had prepuces, yet the genes never figured out that not having them was superior.
Okay. And in fact, thank goodness 6,000 years ago, some folks figured out that it was superior. Right? Because even in humans, it wasn't done until 6,000 years ago. Okay, so maybe it is good for your health. I don't know. But I don't think that the arguments presented for why it's beneficial are enough to outweigh whatever the deficits are. Because if they did, I'm assuming that 2 million years of evolution would have figured that out. Okay, so I'm not being very crisp with that. All right. So that's pretty much this chapter. What do you think of it? Is it a good chapter? Is it worth saying? Is it anybody? John?
Yeah, I like it. I find it valuable for my own thinking to have this test. And I was actually going to follow up in terms of how we should think when we reason about new hypotheses. So, for example, with the why do humans take a long time to learn how to walk? one thing I thought was that we established, or we believe that humans acquire memes from their parents when they're young.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that was a priority, like a computational priority for the brain to acquire memes. So I'm not saying I believe this or anything. I just, how would we evaluate this new hypothesis in terms of the net effect that you mentioned of the benefits and
Yes, I think I get your question. And I thought about it a little myself, but not adequate. So what I comes to mind in my, and it's related to what you said, is that gazelles, for example, get eaten if they don't start moving. But humans don't. We just live in different environments. So that seems a factor of it. But because of the environment we live in, like if you had a baby, human baby, I mean, and it was walking, say, 3 hours after it was born, what is dangerous to it? What is not dangerous to it, right? That is to say, and what is dangerous to a human baby changes very rapidly in human society. You know, they didn't have plugs. They didn't have, for example, hair dryers laying around near sinks where water was, right? You don't want your baby just walking around, right? There's hazards, and those hazards for humans are different through time, very rapidly changing. And so I think that you're perhaps right, John, that what has to happen is the meme transfer has to happen enough so that by the time the baby's walking, it knows enough to not run into disaster. Now, as it grows, it's given more liberty of where it can walk, but that may be related to as it's learned enough to be given that liberty.
I guess that's where, like turtles, they say like, they have to go from like the sand to the ocean. And that's like the big like
Oh,
pilgrimage they have to make, and like most of them die beforehand. I guess that's why
yeah.
turtles are of course able to walk when they're first born, is because they like have that need to go into the ocean before they get snatched up.
You're right.
Hmm.
And I want to get back to that, Jason, because I thought about these turtles some because they're an interesting case. Um, Ryan, what are your
Um,
thoughts?
so you asked what we thought of the chapter. I think it's a really interesting idea for a chapter. It's also very related to my term paper. One
Hmm.
like interesting other thing that I'm considering with the term paper is like how does this relate to things like neurological disorders? So things like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, because if you look at the evidence, people with ADHD tend to have, on average, far fewer children, especially people with autism, far, far fewer children. But then there's also like assortative mating, so that sort of like maybe like makes up for it. So I think there's a lot of interesting nuance
Wait,
there.
what was the some?
Assortative mating. So there's strong evidence that people with ADHD tend to mate with other people with ADHD. So my
Ah,
hypothesis is like ADHD on average decreases your reproductive fitness, but it makes up for that in sustaining itself by ensuring that the person that you do reproduce with also probably has the same disorder.
now that's a very interesting study, and you know, unless you guys really work hard, you're all going to get A's, and so this is not about grades, right? But I also don't want to steal your thunder. That is to say, I think you have a lot of good ideas. Would you be willing to explore them a little bit now? as opposed
Um,
to,
sure. I mean, I haven't obviously finished the paper, but I've done like a bit of the background research.
yeah,
So more broadly, I'm looking at like altruistic preens. So like I mentioned, like homosexuality is like a special case of that, as are like autism, ADHD. And I'm I'm wondering, I'm one part that I'm still like struggling with is like there are some disorders that like really detrimentally affect reproductive fitness. So something like Down syndrome. Um,
yeah,
I think those people very rarely reproduce, if at all. So it, is it like a mistake that those happen? Or the best theory I could come up with is like if you're familiar with RL terms, reinforcement learning, there's like an exploration term in the reinforcement learning like optimization process. So like with some small probability, it'll try something that's probably really stupid, but might actually be like really smart. And then that's like
yeah,
how it sort of discovers new things that are like super cool. So maybe there's like, some ludicrously small chance that by creating, the same sorts of we call them mistakes, but just changes, mutations that would lead to something like Down syndrome. Maybe there's a tiny chance that actually it leads to like the next generation of superhumans. So it'll just like this mutation engine that we sort of described when we were talking about like HIV, sort of just has some small probability to just like do something whatever, and with some very small chance it'll create something really good. And most of the time, that that organism will probably not like advance things, but just having that exploration term is beneficial to the evolution overall. And if as long as it doesn't happen too often, it's not going to hurt the species much at all.
I understand your comments. They make a lot of sense, but I'm not sure that we've tracked you, and I've thought about some of these issues. We track them down to a satisfactory point where we can distill out of all the information we have about, say, syndrome or ADHD, that we can distill out of it all um, some enduring understanding. Right. There's a lot of
Right.
information. Okay, so, huh?
Oh, I was just going to say there's one more consideration, which is
Yes.
for some of the other like not Down syndrome, like some like the disorders that I mentioned initially, like ADHD, autism, and dyslexia. Those are also commonly like associated with improved, like they have upsides. So I think as a society we tend to like consider them as disorders, but I'm also sort of postulating that because the brains, if we consider the brain size to be constrained, which maybe it is, maybe it isn't, then in order to have an upside, there must necessarily be a downside. So like people with autism, a lot of times will have like improved problem solving capabilities, but almost always have like reduced social
Yeah,
skills.
I understand.
Um, so I'm thinking something like autism could be like it's a mutation that increases problem solving, but then comes with a downside. But then that downside isn't a downside because of assortative mating, which kind of
Yeah,
encourages
so
it to prioritize reproducing.
really good thoughts, and I it's a very familiar setting to me that you feel like you're chasing this lead after that lead after this. Well, maybe then this and right. And that's part of the job of a theoretician. Okay. But this this chasing all this stuff around is an indication that there's a whole lot of processes and interactions and all of this stuff. I liken it to looking into chaos. And the job is to, in that chaos, if there's actually some enduring value then you've discovered something. Okay, so for example, you can look at the universe, but and all sorts of weird stuff is going on. It could look chaotic, I suppose, but the physicist says, well, look, there's this thing called energy, and it's conserved despite all of this chaos and mass energy, I guess we'd say today. And, there's this thing, gravity, that is having something to do with how all these things are moving around. So a theoretician's job is often to look into chaos and distill something from it that's enduring and explains some of what's going on and explains it in a very succinct way. Then you've discovered. All right. So, but let's choose one of them. Let's choose Down syndrome. Okay. So, do we think that Down syndrome is really a design decision by the genes? That is, did the genes decide what a great idea to have a certain portion of people have Down syndrome? Or do we think it's an unfortunate accident, right? Now, if it's an unfortunate, okay, so consider those two cases. And there may be others, I don't know. Do we think that Down syndrome was something that the genes intended to do? Or even more subtly, do we think that the Down syndromes were making a trade-off of the type you're talking about? That it was worthwhile to endure the burden of loss of reproduction and other possible burdens, because by going down that path, there were also benefits that accrued. They occasionally result in Down syndrome. And of course, I don't know. I mean, these are really very good questions. It may not be that we'll be able to figure it out. I'm reminded of the case of sickle cell anemia. You aware of it? Okay, so here is the current thinking on the standard hypotenuse. Okay, it is that sickle cell anemia happens, there's, as you know, all the genes are paired, one from your mother, one from your father. Okay, and that there's a gene, which is, we'll call it the sickle cell positive gene. And if you get two of them, you proceed to get what's called sickle cell anemia, where your red blood cells have a funny shape, at least at sometimes. And, it's a bad disease. All right. Now, however, it's currently assumed that if you just get one of those genes, one sickle cell and one non-sickle cell version of the gene, then the claim is you're protected against malaria. Yeah. And since in some environments, malaria is a big killer, that this particular arrangement is still beneficial to the genes, because you have a certain population of sickle cell positive alleles and a certain cell population of non-positive. And if you get one of them, you're protected against this thing that kills a lot of people. If you get two of them, you have a disease that is detrimental. So where does that fit into the picture? And did somebody else raise a hand or something? Or I don't know. Okay. So there are these kind of suspected trade-offs, which sometimes are very detrimental. Could it be that Down syndrome is one of those? It sounds like that's one tenable hypothesis. Yes, but it's not because so much that someday a Down syndrome child will be born at just the right moment when the environment nurtures them, and they become the next successful version of the species. That's a harder case for me to make, but the case that, like sickle cell anemia, maybe these Down syndrome kids are just the collateral damage of a process that overall is beneficial. Okay, Ryan?
I guess I'm still struggling with like if I'm understanding what you're proposing correctly, essentially like you have like this sort of continuous spectrum. I mean, I guess in this case with sickle cell anemia, it's not very continuous. It's just 0, 1, or 2. But you have like a spectrum, and so there's like a random sort of choice along that spectrum. And if it exceeds some threshold, then you get something detrimental. But if it maybe is a little bit more than 0, it can be beneficial. What I'm struggling with is like, why then have the genes not figured out like, oh, don't go past this threshold, it's bad?
Good question, and I don't know the answer. That's the usual caveat on all of these things, but I suspect that to ensure that you only get one and you never get two of the sickle cell alleles, might require unraveling the whole sexual reproduction apparatus, because it's now pretty fixed, right? And the gametes are formed in the mother and they're formed in the father. And the gametes can only have one gene or the other. And so it seems like it'd be very difficult, given sexual reproduction, to either overturn that entirely, which would be pretty amazing, or to somehow add on to it an additional mechanism that would say, well, wait a minute, maybe this is the case. So here's another string to pull on. A lot of babies or ovum apparently do not end up producing children. The ovum may form, but it may not grow to, it may not embed, it may not, all these things. Is it the case that there is a process in the ovum that somehow looks for bad things in this ovum and tries to mitigate their effects? Now, I don't know what really happens inside the ovum, but I do know that not every zygote, a fertilized ovum, ends up, I should have been calling it zygote all the time, ends up maturing into a baby. So it maybe at that point, additional constraints have been put on to avoid certain bad things. John?
Yeah, could it be that evolution works kind of like in good enough terms? I mean, if there is some disadvantage, as long as it's not bad enough to cause an extinction, then it maybe it's good enough to guarantee survival. Kind of like the idea that to succeed you must first survive. Is that another way of looking at it? I mean, otherwise we would have to have plausible explanations for all genetic disadvantages, and that doesn't seem, I don't know, that doesn't seem
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I sort of understand, but this good enough principle. But just my intuition says that's not going to lead us to an adequate understanding of what's going on. Uh, uh, but you've also made me think uh, about what are they called? Uh, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, scabies. What are the mad cow disease? What are those things? Prions. We'll get back to prions shortly.
Oh yeah, I've
Fine.
had scabies. That one's pretty gnarly.
Oh, you did.
Oh yeah, it's awful.
Okay, wait,
Would
wait, wait,
never.
wait. But Jason,
Yeah.
let me get Ryan's comment, and then I want to turn to your
Okay.
your experience.
Oh, this was, I guess, getting back to like autism, for instance. There's also an interesting point that some of these, like, if two parents have autism, it's not even necessarily all that likely that their child also has autism. So I'm also wondering if like these sort of disorders, it's more so that like the genetic engine has been evolving to like get the right proportion of them, because I'm not sure, like when we talk about evolution, a lot of times it seems like we sort of implicitly assume that there's like a best option for all of the organisms to evolve. But I think what's actually happening here is like there's, and again, we talked about this in the HIV conversation where we talked about like the glycoproteins sort of constantly getting replaced because of the mutagenic engine, whatever you want to call it, polymorphic engine.
Right.
So I think what's actually happening with, or a better explanation perhaps of what's happening, is that there's like sort of a shared or mostly shared, I don't know, mutagenic engine, and it's like evolving the correct proportions. And so in specifically in a social organism like humans, it's sometimes beneficial to sacrifice the reproductive fitness of the individual in order to increase the reproductive fitness, or just like the fitness in general of the
Absolutely.
society, which
Absolutely.
then leads to things like the gay uncle hypothesis and also like the grandmother hypothesis. Um, but I think specifically the gay uncle hypothesis, they mentioned it like only makes sense in the context of a social animal. But I think we also see homosexual individuals in like less social or communal, I guess is a better word, species.
Um, okay, a lot of stuff. And it when you say the things you're saying, it's leading me to 1,000 other thoughts as you say them. Because I spent a long time in Greenland and come across these things. But we haven't resolved them. And I do want to turn to prions, which may be another one of these hypotheses that has inadequate support. Let me turn to the what the not tragic, but the unfortunate case of Jason and scabies. So what happened?
Um, well, being in college, I like it was like going around Cal Poly where I was going. And
Yeah.
then I think it came from sharing climbing shoes at the local a climbing gym. And
Okay.
then yeah, it's awful. It's I don't know if you've heard there's a man named Rainn Wilson who acted in the show The Office, and I read his autobiography, and he described it as his like the worst experience he's experienced in life. And I'd have to agree it's pretty high up there. So
Okay.
yeah.
Jason, before we go on, maybe I've misspoken, but there's a collection of diseases, one of which is most famous of which is mad cow disease.
Hmm.
Another one is called, and that happens, not surprisingly, to cows. Another one is called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, and it happens to humans. Uh, I forget what its symptoms are, but they aren't good. Um, Another one is, I thought scabies was such a disease.
Well, this one's not a disease per se. It's
A
like
symptom.
thousands of mites that burrow inside of your body and lay eggs.
Oh, okay. Yes,
Hmm.
that's okay. I think I've confused things, but I'm glad you recovered from that as well.
Yeah. No, yeah. It's as bad as it sounds. So,
Yeah, I believe it.
hmm.
Okay, but I guess, can do a search here and say, what are other diseases like mad cow disease? Okay, bovine spongiform encephalopathy. Okay, that is mad cow disease. Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Kuru. Kuru is another one. I forget who gets those. Kuru, a prion disease that was historically found in New Guinea, associated with cannibalistic processes. Uh, let's see. Okay. I got confused because it's called scrapies. Scrapies, not whatever Jason got. Okay. Scrapies is a prion disease affecting sheep and goats. So, transmissible mink encephalopathy. It affects minks. Okay, so there's this whole collection of diseases, and they're very curious. Uh, have you guys encountered these things before? Are you aware of them? Uh, Ray, show the lower thumb if you aren't aware of them, and I should look at participants. Oh, you're not aware of them. Okay, all right, all right. So people are not aware of them. So let me explain. Um, all of the diseases I named are devastating and in most cases lead to death. But they do have a very long incubation period, which can be measured in some cases in years. All right. In the case of humans who get the form of this kind of disease, it can take 20 years before they show. Now, the problem with this disease is when these diseases were noticed, and they all seem, despite the animal that's getting them, they all seem to be pretty much the same kind of disease. Despite, okay, so people would ask the question, what's the etiology? What's with this disease? What's causing it? And they searched for the usual culprits, apparently. And I'm just recalling what I called. So they looked for bacterial infections. and they look for virus infections. And none of those panned out. And further, they did experiments, and I don't know how they did them, where they would take the brain, where the brain gets all messed up physiologically, and you can see that it's all messed up post-mortem. And they realized that if an animal who had the disease was eaten by another animal of the same species that didn't have the disease would develop in the animal that ate it. So if you go around eating brains, this sort of thing could happen and spread. And that's why it's associated with cannibalism. And that's why in the case of mad cow disease, it was because farmers or ranchers, I guess, I don't know, cattlemen would slaughter and sell the meat of cows, but the brains and everything, apparently they would process and then feed as feed in the form of maybe kibbles back to the cows. And therefore, the cows would be cannibalizing the brains of other cows. All right. They've stopped that process since because of this disease. So this is a lot of stuff, but they even, this is my recollection, took brains that they had the disease, and if they already knew that if they fed them to other individuals of the appropriate species, the one eating them would get the disease. And I think they even tried to see, what if we burn the brains of the diseased individual pretty much down to a crisp and feed that to a new, say, cow? Would it get the disease? And the answer seems to have come out that it would get the disease. And so there was this sort of mysterious infectious agent, and it didn't appear to be bacteria, it didn't appear to be viral. And what was it? Okay. And thus the notion of a prion arose. And a prion was just a molecule of a certain type. It was a bioactive molecule found in the brains of individuals, but it could take two forms. The two forms were such that in the normal form, all the physiologically desirable things would occur. But if even one of those molecules sort of acquired a different shape, which was possible, and assume this abnormal form, then that one molecule would start to catalyze all the normal molecules and change them into these abnormal forms. And eventually, it would destroy the brain. All these abnormal forms would clump together and bad things would happen in the brain. Okay, so that's the story of prions. And the prion theory, I think, was accepted. It's possible that the guy who did this work, or the people who did most of this work, won the Nobel Prize because of it. I don't know, but I think that might have been the case. But I've always been very uncomfortable with the idea of the explanation of how prions work and why they're there. And it is for me, it's one of these cui bono things. All right. So I've said a lot. Do you Okay, let's take our 10-minute break. Return at 3:05, and then maybe we'll get to the bottom of this story because it's an interesting one, I think. All right, I'll see you guys then. Hello.
How's it going, Professor?
Very well, thank you.
Good break.
Yes, it was a good break for me because I get carried away with research. And uh, I mean, it's fun. So, but I came to my senses on the break and think we should proceed with the book in the interest of, we only have so many lectures to go. So I'll deal with prions on my own, but thank you for raising the question and all the other stuff, especially, Ryan exposing some of his thesis. Okay.
What will our genes do now? We live for about 73 years. That is up from about 30 years just a couple of centuries ago. In When Do Humans Die? We saw that because our genes are slow to change, they probably had little to do with this increase. But surely the genes are trying to help us live longer, they are just slow in making the needed changes.
So, right, the genes have been working very hard to keep us alive, and they've succeeded to get us up to 73 years, and they're going to keep trying, and we're just going to live longer and longer with the genes' help, right? Well, I don't think so.
But surely the genes are trying to help us live longer, they are just slow in making the needed changes. This could be the case, but don't bet on it. Though evolution is far too complex for me to predict what the genes will do, my guess is that they are trying to shorten our lives. Let's consider whether the current design used to build us is a good one. From the pre-theoretic perspective, we are asking if the current design is close to maximizing the ROI, see when do creatures die? There are reasons to suspect that it isn't. Since the average age of menopause is 51, McKinley, Brambill, and Posner, 2008, women produce few children after age 60. In addition, since at 60 the average age of last-born children will be above 9 years, the contributions women make to the success of last-born children will be small. With respect to men, though occasionally there are reports, often without convincing evidence, of men over 60 fathering children, there is much scientific evidence that the fecundity of older men is significantly lower than that of younger men. So, even if some of these reports are correct, such post-60 fathering seems rare and is probably a simple case of monkeys and typewriters. Though the situation is complex, it seems that the genes might get closer to maximizing ROI by two very different approaches. They could extend our reproductive lives, or they could reduce our life expectancy. For example, the genes could design individuals with less expensive hearts, lungs, immune systems, and other parts, thereby lowering the life expectancy to about 60 and lowering the cost of manufacturing humans, without significantly reducing the number of children each individual produces. Hence raising ROI. Lecture 22, 2025.
Okay, so that is just saying, and this is consistent with earlier chapters. The genes don't care how long you live. They're just trying to maximize the ROI, copy numbers in our context. And so when I look at if I were the genes, which of course I'm not, and it's very complex, and I look at the current situation of human beings, I got a lot of people that are living, beyond 60. And but they're not producing any children. They're not contributing to the ROI very much. Okay. And as a result of that, it could well be that the right thing to do is to cut back on the age and build cheaper human beings with not as quite as good hearts and lungs and things like that, and still keep the reproductive years going. And because humans are cheaper to build, you get more of them, right? So that could be the case. I lean towards thinking it is. All right. Now here's another, the next chapter.
Are our genes trying to kill us? Before leaving the topic of why and when we die, let's consider the question of whether our genes are actively trying to kill us rather than just letting us die of neglect.
Okay. So what do you think? I mean, why would the genes be trying to kill us? Well, let's find out.
Neglect. Our genes would never do such a terrible thing, right? Of course they would. They will do anything if it helps them survive. In fact, I suspect they are already doing it. For example, some biologists have theorized that mammalian cells have a sort of countdown timer based on telomeres. A telomere is a sequence of nucleotides found at the end of a chromosome. When a cell reproduces, the length of the telomere in the offspring is less than the length in the parent. When a descendant of the original cell has a telomere that is sufficiently small, the clock has hit zero, and that cell cannot reproduce.
So just to make it clear, some biologists have theorized, and there's evidence to support it, I haven't looked at it much, that mammalian cells sort of have, at the end of their chromosomes, these strings of A, T, C's, and G's. And every time the cell replicates, divides, a byte is taken off the end of this telomere. And so if you're descendant from the zygote, the original egg, by 7 generations, you've had 7 bytes taken off. Right? All right. So, and okay. All right. And when all of the telomere is gone, the cell can no longer reproduce. It's a countdown timer. Yes. So that says that from the zygote, no cell can sort of be more than a certain number of reproductive cycles away from the zygote. Okay. All right. So let's.
For example, some biologists have theorized that mammalian cells have a sort of countdown timer based on telomeres. A telomere is a sequence of nucleotides found at the end of a chromosome. When a cell reproduces, the length of the telomere in the offspring is less than the length in the parent. When a descendant of the original cell has a telomere that is sufficiently small, the clock has hit zero, and that cell cannot reproduce. This limits the number of descendants a cell can have, and consequently how long an individual can live. Why do this? It has been hypothesized that the limit on replication is a defense against cancer. Hence, the genes may put a time bomb in us that assures our death by a gene-chosen time, in order to lower the death rate and raise the reproductive prospects of the young.
So this telomere thing, this countdown timer, let's assume it does exist. Then why would the genes do such a thing? Well, one argument is that cancers being the result of uncontrolled cellular division, this countdown timer sort of can stop a cancer by creating cell, but they run out of their ability to divide after a while. Yes, you follow that notion? Okay, so maybe there's a benefit to putting this on, but it also guarantees that all of us will be mortal, because eventually we can't, for example, make new blood cells or new immune cells or that, because the timers have run out. So it's giving up immortality, which isn't there anyway, but it's putting a date of death on all of us in return for this at least hypothesized, defense against cancers. So maybe a lot of cancers that humans do get are in fact stopped before they kill the human, and never become clinical at all because the tumors have used up their timers.
Hence, the genes may put a time bomb in us that assures our death by a gene-chosen time, in order to lower the death rate and raise the reproductive prospects of the young. Like burning a candle at both ends, genes that enhance the young to the detriment of the old may be favored. If one wishes to significantly extend the lifespan of individuals, then preserving, repairing, or replacing failing parts may not be enough. It may be necessary to defuse the time bombs that the genes have set. Lecture 20.
Okay, so just something worth saying. Okay, now we're out of the part 2, humans. And now we're going to turn to part 3, computers.
You may have noticed that computers seem to be taking over the world. What is a computer anyway? Where did they come from? More importantly, where are they going and what does it mean for humanity? What a piece of work is a computer? In 1936, British mathematician Alan Turing published On Computable Numbers, with an application to the Instudungsproblem, Turing, 1936, which is now commonly viewed as the start of the computer revolution. In that paper, Turing did at least 2 remarkable things. He laid the theoretical foundation for the concept of a computer, and he provided a roadmap for building one. Just prior to the Second World War, Turing began to follow that roadmap and build proto-computers that succeeded in breaking German secret codes. The process culminated on February 15, 1946, when the first human-made computer, ENIAC, was unveiled at the University of Pennsylvania. Figure 30.
So there's ENIAC. And at the University of Pennsylvania, February 15th, 1946, this was unveiled. And it's as reasonable as anything else to call this the first commercial or computer. By the way, Turing was also trying to build a commercial or physical computer, not just his Turing machine, after the war. And but these guys at University of Pennsylvania got there first. So this is sort of as good as any, a picture of the first computer. All right.
ENIAC used vacuum tubes to store numbers, that is, to store ENIAC's first Turines. Turing's theoretical foundation for computers was perhaps as important as his roadmap for building one. It was the beginning of over 80 years of investigation that has brought us a deep understanding of the laws that govern computation. We have learned what a computer is and is not. A computer is a universal machine. It is a machine in the sense of physics, a physical thing that occupies a certain chunk of space for a certain period of time and obeys the laws of physics. And it is universal, which means that anything any machine can compute, it can also compute. Put less precisely, a universal machine, aka a computer, can be programmed to compute all things that are computable. For example, all universal machines can be programmed to play chess, guide a rocket to Proxima Centauri b, decide whether a number is prime or not, and lots more. An abacus can compute many things, but it cannot play chess, hence it cannot be universal and is not a computer. We have also learned that computers are not the predictable things we may have initially thought they were. Very far from it. Computers can be programmed to do very, very complex things, and are provably unpredictable. It may be that programmed computers are the least predictable things that can exist.
Now that's kind of a grandiose statement. But, there was a time when people thought machines were just like very simple, and you could predict what they were going to do. I mean, it wasn't really an issue. And of course, that's before the halting problem and girdle incompleteness and all this. All right. So I'm making an assertion that program computers may be the least predictable things that exist at all. So what do you think about that? What could be less predictable than a computer? I mean, I don't know. Now, some may rate Ryan.
Oh, I was just gonna say that if you had something that's like less predictable than a computer, you can probably like make some kind of mapping reduction to just say, oh, it is actually just a computer. I don't know, just a theory.
Could you expand on that just a bit more?
I don't know. Say we have something that we claim is more difficult to predict than a computer. Maybe
Mhm.
it's some quantum process or something, and its
Yes.
programming is just like the initial configuration state. You can probably just like make some kind of like mapping reduction to just say, well, okay, we can simulate this as thus and such computer, and it's still a computer.
Yes, and that's part of what makes me say this. So a couple of observations. One is quantum computers, if they exist, um, may in fact compute some things faster than non-quantum computers, but they don't compute more, right? So quantum computers compute the same set of things that can be computed on classical computers. It's just they do it faster. So that won't stand in the way of this assertion. Okay. And now what Ryan is saying is, I think that let's say there was some chunk of space-time, a machine, for want of a better word, that was less predictable, then there is a sense that, but I'm not sure this is right, that given a chunk of space-time, we could make a classical computer that would know enough physics and everything to very laboriously simulate that presumably largely finite chunk of space-time in such detail that the computer could also reach the same unpredictable behavior. Right. That's the sort of essence of your thinking, Ryan. Yeah. And so that's part of my thinking too. But of course, none of this is a proof of anything. But the assertion is still, I think, tenable. Um, and so these things that were supposed to be very predictable turn out to be the least predictable of all things. Or maybe. Okay. All right. There is a chapter on computer viruses, but we already sort of took care of that earlier. Oh, I do have something that recalls the computer virus stuff. A little what I call a reenactment. So this is what I recall of my discussion with Fred Cohen, who is the uh, father of the computer virus in my mind. Okay. All right. So Fred was a fairly big guy. He was a rugby player or something, right? And if you look at him, he's much more sort of threatening than I could ever be. And so he comes up after class and he says, Professor, I have this idea for a new computer threat. And okay, wait, hang on for just a second. Okay, and so he says, I said, what is it? And he describes it to me. And my response was, yep, that would work, Fred. And his response was, I want to try it. And my response was, you don't have to try it. It will obviously work. I want to try it. Fred, there's no point. It will work. I want to try it. I want to try it. I want to try it. And so eventually, of course, Fred did get the opportunity to try it. And, the rest is history, as they say. Okay. So,
What does a computer look like? We have grown accustomed to thinking that computers are made of silicon, plastic, metal, and other solid materials, and that they are electronic. But must a computer be like that? Could a computer be liquid and make no use of electricity at all? The answer is yes. In 1993, I ran an experiment in which biomolecules such as DNA and proteins were dissolved in water and used to solve an instance of a computational problem called the traveling salesman problem. The main part of this molecular computation took place in a single drop of water inside a small test tube, Adel-Manel, 1994, Adel-Manel, 1998. The experiment demonstrated what the theory of computation had always suggested: computers can take many forms. And while it was hard to imagine putting an electronic computer inside a cell, it was not difficult to imagine putting a molecular computer inside one. In fact, it became clear that cells had been using molecular computers for billions of years. While my experiment with molecular computation was primitive, the molecular computations inside of cells were astonishing. Cells are not merely bags of molecules randomly encountering and interacting with one another. They are exquisite computational devices programmed by their genes to guide the struggle to survive. We saw in variation and natural selection that cells use extremely sophisticated molecular computation to orchestrate their reproduction. Here is another example of how they use molecular computation in impressive ways. Likely billions of years ago, bacteria used their molecular computers to develop a bacterial internet. Bacteria could communicate with one another using processes called horizontal gene transfer. For example, using a process called conjugation, Wikipedia BJ, one bacterium could extend a tube, called a pilus, and penetrate another. DNA from the former could be passed to the latter.
okay, so here's a picture. These are two bacterium, and this thing is called the pilus, I guess. And one of these, I'll assume the one on the left, though I don't know, has extended this pilus and penetrated the other of these bacteria. And then along that pilus, which is apparently a tube with an opening in it, the first bacterium passes chunks of DNA to the second one. Okay. And so this is part of the bacterial internet, as I call it. Okay. And the caption here is a bacterium downloading a software update from another bacterium. So, and by the way, my understanding, though I'm not sure of this, is that these bacteria can do that between different species. That is, they can actually, you might have an E. coli and a salmonella do this. Pretty crazy stuff. Okay, so in this sense, there's a bacterial internet where this is not just division, right? This is something different, where essentially genes can be passed from one bacterium to another. So, so what good could, why do the bacterium need an internet, or how could they use it?
What could bacteria possibly talk about on their internet? Among other things, they can use it to communicate important new discoveries. For example, much to our chagrin, they currently use it to rapidly spread antibiotic resistance.
Okay, so it seems to turn out that you have some bacterium, and it is not, and it's evolved to be resistant to, say, penicillin. Such things occur. And well, its resistance is born from some genetic change that it had over similar bacteria that weren't resistant. Yes, I mean, that's just the way it's going to work. And what appears to happen is these bacterium use the internet to pass the new improved genes to other bacteria. Now, it's much more elaborate than that. But in addition, what happens over time is that, let's say a gene becomes, a bacterium becomes resistant to penicillin, and another bacterium becomes resistant to anthromycin. Okay. Then with time, it turns out that you get these little circular pieces of DNA called, whatever they're called, plasmids, I think. And it will have both the gene that confers resistance to penicillin and the gene that confers resistance to anthromycin, all on one little package. And that is being sent along the internet. And so what happens with time, these plasmids grow, and they contain a lot of antibiotic resistant genes that confer resistance on those that have them. So, and these get passed around. And this is what leads to, multi-resistant bacteria that our repertoire of antibiotics, it's resistance to all of them, or at least a huge number of them. I mean, it's a crazy deal, but bacteria are doing this, right? This is the level to which molecular computation has risen in the natural world. It's really very sophisticated. Okay. All right, so.
A new type of computer. While cells compute using molecular components, multicellular organisms have learned to compute using cellular ones. Multicellular organisms have been around for a few billion years. But between 500 to 600 million years ago, when the Cambrian explosion occurred, they changed dramatically. Based on the work of paleontologists, I have the impression that prior to the explosion, these organisms were slow-moving or sessile and either did not react at all or reacted very slowly to changes in the surrounding conditions.
By the way, you of course know what the word sessile means, right? Well, me neither, but I learned, so I'll tell you. All right, so sessile means you don't actively move yourself. That is, you may move because you're sort of like a blade of grass underwater, and you may move with the water ebbs and flows, but you don't actively sort of direct your own movements. Okay, that's what sessile means. Okay, so we have this very sophisticated molecular computation thing going on for a very long time. And one-celled animals rely on it pretty much totally. All of their computations are molecular. But around 500 million years ago, well, in fact, further back than that, we started to get multicellular living things. And while initially they probably also just relied on molecular computation to do whatever they were doing, sometime or other, something happened. And here's what happened.
Multicellular organisms have been around for a few billion years. But between 500 to 600 million years ago, when the Cambrian explosion occurred, they changed dramatically. Based on the work of paleontologists, I have the impression that prior to the explosion, these organisms were slow-moving or sessile and either did not react at all or reacted very slowly to changes in the surrounding conditions. Most of these organisms apparently went extinct when the explosion occurred, and they were supplanted by a multitude of multicellular organisms that are much like those that exist today.
Okay, so the Cambrian explosion is famous, right? Because it's one of those events, sort of like the Chicxulub impactor, that suddenly changes huge amount of species on Earth and leaves this sort of residue in the fossil record where below a certain actually visible line that you can find pretty much everywhere in the world, if you dig down, you find things like dinosaur fossils. And then above it, you'd never find another one again. And you start to see the emergence of organisms, fossils of organisms, that there's no copies that have been found below this critical line in the Earth. Okay. And so the Chicxulub impactor did that kind of thing. But before that, there was the famous Cambrian explosion. Now, you might think Cambrian explosion means that some big physical event like the Chicxulub thing happened, but it doesn't refer to that. What it refers to is another line or strata that you can find if you dig down, pretty much anywhere on Earth, where all of a sudden, a lot of species that existed are never found again above this line. And a lot of things above the line, there's no record of them below the line. Yes. And that explosion was very important, for example, to us or mammals in general and lots of other things, because the change in the organisms was very different. So before whatever caused the Cambrian explosion occurred, you had these, as best we can tell, living things that were extremely slowly moving, if they moved at all, and sessile might be a better description. They just may have moved by wiggle, letting the environment move them. But they were a different sort of thing. And it's only after that that you get things like us, or gazelles, or anything you and I would normally consider to be living. Okay? All right. So the question that I'm addressing here is, what caused the Cambrian explosion? All right. And as you might imagine, there's been many hypotheses as to what may have caused it. And you might imagine that those hypotheses are things like this.
There are several hypotheses regarding the cause of the explosion, but no consensus exists. Some of these hypotheses suggest that large environmental changes, such as a rise in oxygen level, were the cause. Perhaps this.
Okay, so you can imagine that people would have thought, look for the usual suspects. Some big change in the weather, some big change in the oxygen content of the atmosphere. Lots of things come to mind, and there's a sort of standard collection of suspects, I think. But I'm going to throw out another possibility here, which I don't know if people have considered, but and I can't support, but I thought it was worth saying.
Perhaps this is the case. But it might also be that dramatic changes in the fossil record could occur without large changes in the environment. Perhaps the Cambrian explosion can, at least partially, be laid at the feet of a newly evolved type of cell, the neuron. Neurons allowed for the rapid transmission of information, the development of brains, and the storage of memes. Many of the organisms that arose after the explosion incorporated neurons and exploited these features. For example, soon after the explosion, planarians, a form of flatworm, appeared.
Right. So this new type of cell, the neuron, seems to have evolved right around then. I believe it's the case you don't find anything you can identify as neuronal in the fossil record before this Cambrian explosion. And then after it, you get fossils of things that we have reason to believe do have neurons, and some of them, like the flatworm, still exist. All right. So
many of the organisms that arose after the explosion incorporated neurons and exploited these features. For example, soon after the explosion, planarians, a form of flatworm, appeared. Figure 34, planarian.
There's our friend, the planarian, searching for Ediacaran biota. Ediacaran refers to the period of time before the explosion. Okay.
Each planarian had hundreds of thousands of cells and a brain composed of about 10,000 neurons. This brain was programmed to receive signals from the planarian's light-detecting eye spots. When light was detected, the brain would transmit a fast-moving signal down primitive spinal cords, also composed of neurons, to muscles that created movement. As a result, the planarian could rapidly move away from light and avoid hazards such as dehydration. These neuron-exploiting post-explosion creatures could run circles around their sluggish pre-explosion predecessors. Perhaps this was a significant reason why the predecessors went extinct.
Just a hypothesis. No evidence, but I thought it was worth throwing out there. You guys have any other hypotheses as to why this extinction event occurred? We know it did occur. What we're lacking is a reason for it. John?
Yeah, I definitely don't have the knowledge required to produce an intelligent hypothesis, but I will comment on one thing that I've been reading about, which is the fact that the Earth appears to have gone through many periodic ice ages. And I'm not saying that this is what caused this particular case of the Cambrian explosion, but just that geological events seem very related to evolution of living things, and so I think it would be expected that this happens. These huge extinction events happen with some frequency, given how old the Earth is.
Yeah, so I think that that's certainly tenable, but this appears to be a whole world extinction event. And most of the ice ages that we see aren't whole world events, first of all. And second of all, a lot of species have survived a lot of ice ages, including humans. And so, Mhm.
I didn't mean that it would explain the Cambrian explosion, and I actually like the idea that maybe it wasn't a change from the environment. Maybe it was the neuron or some innovation, let's say, like some innovation from the preens.
like for example, yes. So this is highly speculative. I don't have any evidence that this is the reason. But consider the following. Let's look at computers. If you look at the picture of ENIAC, it had all these vacuum tubes, right? But soon thereafter, there was an extinction event. Anybody know what I'm getting to?
Transistors, right?
The transistor, right? That was an extinction event for all those things using
I think was in
vacuum.
45 the invention of the transistor, if I'm not mistaken. Which is
45?
yeah.
Okay.
So it was the ENIAC was born with its extinction already declared.
You're right. Okay, good point. Now, yeah, so it was destined to go away, right? Nobody builds these things anymore. But in addition, even there were transistors and then there were transistors, right? That is, the first ones were not small or easy to work with, the invention. But then we got to nice small ones, and they replaced the vacuum tubes. They were an extinction event just caused by a technological change, right? And then if we move further, we get the integrated circuit thing, right? Which killed off all of the things that were built with these transistors you could buy at Radio Shack, right? And so that is to some extent analogous to what mumbling about in this assertion about how very dramatic extinction events can occur without environmental change that's noticeable.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
sorry to
No, please.
but in the case of the integrated circuits, you had the process that we call Moore's law
Yes.
started taking place, and that was a phenomenal ROI, maximizing ROI situation.
It absolutely was.
Yeah, so something similar
Yeah.
might have happened with the Cambrian explosion.
Well, since you bring it up, okay, so all of a sudden the neuron pops into existence. And presumably it did become more efficient with time. That is, to run a neuron, you got to have pumps that pump out potassium or blah blah blah. I don't know, in your cells. So that could have become much more efficient. That's one thing. But if we assume it's not the neuron itself that keeps improving, it seems like it's the organization of neurons that keep improving, which is much akin to the programs and computer architecture. Is that where the ROI really goes up?
In the case of the computer, you could make the case that it was just the hardware, like just pushing more and more chips into the same square inch.
Yeah, yeah.
There wasn't that much. I mean, there was a lot of innovation in software too, but if you look at a program written in the 60s in Algol or something, you can still read it and it will make sense, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Right. Whereas if you look at hardware from that time, it might be it's very rudimentary compared to what we have now, right? So
Yeah.
in the case of the computers, it was just sheer volume of chips per square inch. And now all of that is changing. But it was a very interesting growth story for sure.
Oh, it was amazing. Yeah. We've run out of time, but I want to leave you with a little story. And the story involves Fred Cohen again. And another graduate student of mine, a now professor, whatever he's doing, Paul Rodeman. And this is the idea of archaic technology. So, have any of you guys got a floppy disk reader? I'm betting the answer is no. Okay. And so when we store information on devices, they typically become extinct, at least in the current era, pretty quickly. They're supplanted. Nobody has the ability to read what was written anymore. So Paul pointed out to me that one of the amazing things about DNA is it's storing information. It's been doing it for, let's say, 3.6 billion years. And still, if you took the gene from some beast that existed 3.6 billion years ago, you could put it in another cell and that ribosome can still read it, right? So that's pretty interesting. And then the other thing is Fred Cohen. So Fred Cohen got his PhD in computer science and then got a law degree. And he became the sort of go-to guy for forensic guy that would appear in trials where somebody claimed, well, I got this floppy disk that's from 1970 that shows clearly that I invented the mouse or whatever it was, right? And these cases of who invented things first were important and became, in some cases, billion-dollar cases. And so Fred had the credentials to be able to testify on whether this floppy disk should be believed or not, because the opponent might say, well, maybe you made that floppy disk yesterday. So Fred probably has the biggest collection of floppy disk readers of anybody in the world, right? In fact, he's got all this ancient technology stuff that will allow him to read all sorts of media that no one else can read anymore. And so, yes, and he once told me his law firm's motto: "We'll never stop trying as long as you never stop paying," which, is probably a large part of many lawyers' mottos, but they don't say it. Anyway, Fred was an extremely interesting guy. Okay, so next time. Oh, Anthony. Yeah, okay. Anthony, what
Oh,
did you have to say?
sorry. Can I just speak to you after class? Sorry about that.
Yeah, I'll stay on. So everybody else, like, go away, please. All right. Bye.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, Mirza. Okay, there are a few people still here, and that could mean they've fallen asleep. So I guess I can remove them. Let me try that. Okay, let's see. Remove. I guess I can. Okay, let me do this. Remove. Just got two more. Remove.
Good to go.
Yeah, I think we're good. Okay.
Okay.
What's up,
I
Anthony?
just wanted to give you a heads up. I'm starting this new job that I'll be getting out at like 2:30. So I won't be able to just join class until around that time.
Okay.
So I just wanted to give you a heads up about that. And then I was also wondering, like for the class, I mean, is it possible to get an A plus in this class by any chance? Um, on
Yeah. Okay. Please go on.
No, go ahead. I was just asking.
Okay. The answer is one, I don't know because I
Okay.
don't pay attention to such things. I don't know. Does USC offer A pluses anymore?
They do actually.
Okay.
So I was just wondering on that.
Okay. However, um, I didn't even know they did. And
Okay.
I think that uh, the answer is probably no, because I probably, the most likely thing that is going to happen is you're going to get an A, and
Hmm.
so is everybody going to get an A,
Uh-huh.
you know, unless, okay. So I don't think I want to venture into the A plus world and have to worry about that and stuff.
Okay. I get what you're
Okay.
saying. Yeah, I
Yeah.
was just wondering because yeah, my GPA is a little right there.
Uh,
I'm taking like the algorithms class and I'm pretty scared about my GPA because of the graduation and all that stuff.
oh, okay. So which algorithms class are you taking?
The 570.
Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah, it's pretty rough.
Okay. Right. Okay. But I'm afraid this is not a path that I want to go down.
No worries. I was just asking.
My
Okay.
pleasure. Good luck
Okay.
with it.
I appreciate
All
it. I'll see
right.
you on Monday.
You too. Uh, whatever I should do here. Okay.